So welcome everybody. My name is Shabir Imber-Safdar. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Safe Medicines. And today we're going to talk about federal advocacy opportunities for family advocates. I started working with family advocates many years ago, but primarily my big upswing in that work started back probably about 7, 8 years ago when I met Carrie Luther. That's picture of Carrie back there with her son Tosh. Tosh was murdered by someone who sold him a fake Xanax that had fentanyl in it. Probably didn't have any actual Xanax in it at all. And she taught me a lot about, what family advocates need and what they want to accomplish. And I've been really lucky since then to work with lots of family advocates. So many so that before the pandemic, we had an annual fly-in to DC, and the Partnership for Safe Medicines advocacy team lined up meetings with Senate offices and House offices. And that's really where I feel like we really came into our own. So today, we're actually going to do something really different for us. We're going to talk about the federal advocacy opportunities with our congressional consultant, Stacey Barrick. And then we're also going to hear from an advocate who's been and spoken at a number of PSM events in Washington, D.C., Lisa Hicks. I will say that, a lot of you may be working on issues at the state level. And they're important issues like whether or not legislators are regulating pill presses and whether or not, prosecutors are charging appropriately when they sell counterfeit pills and someone dies. Those issues are important, but PSM doesn't really have the funding to do both federal and state advocacy around fentanyl and fake pills. And so we tend to focus mostly on federal advocacy. So the fact that I'm not talking about it doesn't mean that those issues aren't important, but there is a limit to how much we can accomplish on the budget we have. So really quickly, the Partnership for Safe Medicines, which has been around since about 2003, is a coalition. And it's funded from dues that come from all the members of the coalition. And this is the current list of our members. We're actually going through renewals right now. So some of these people will leave and some will get added, but it's basically the entire supply chain from the people who make medicines and it's the trade association representing people who make medicines, both research and generic, wholesalers, and then people at the dispensing end, pharmacists and some patient groups. And they tend to be people who've actually had some experience with counterfeits and know the dangers and therefore want us to do the kind of work we do. Everybody pays a little, at least a little, if I have my way and I'm persuasive. And it's a really good group. One rule is that we don't accept any corporate money. So, while a trade association that represents, pharmacists or pharmacies may be a member, the individual corporate entity of the pharmacy can't give. While folks that represent drug manufacturers may belong, their trade association, we can't take money from individual entities that make drugs, the drug companies, specific drug companies. So that's a rule we have. It's a little bit more restricting than other organizations, but it's an important one to us. You can find us online. We actually publish a lot every week and a video every week about counterfeit medicine somewhere in America. We just did a great story about the huge fake HIV medication case that has exploded into the news here in January. But our stuff is on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and LinkedIn and Instagram. And I think that, and of course our website, which is the home for everything. So let's talk about what our agenda for today is. We are going to talk about some of the challenges of the current political climate and getting things done. We're going to talk about how PSM approaches advocacy. I'm going to talk to Lisa Hicks and have Lisa Hicks talk to us about what it's like to be an advocate for PSM. I'm going to ask Stacy to go through what is the major legislation related to counterfeits, counterfeit medicine and drug interdiction that we think we can have an effect on this year, because there's a lot out there and there's a lot that we can't do anything about. And those are some of the realities that we deal with, because if we ask you to help us with something, it's because we believe we can make change. And then I'm going to go through the specific opportunities that you can make a difference. So let's first talk about the current political dynamic. Political polarization right now in Washington is very, very high. And that's actually problematic, because sometimes if you can't get what you want, you can get half of what you want in a compromise, but polarization makes compromise very challenging. Even the fact that people are working together across different parties is an impediment. And so that's really challenging. There's also a very close split in Congress. If you don't want anything to pass, that's actually, I guess, good, because no party seems to hold enough of majority to move things. But if you actually need new policies enacted, let's say around regulating pill presses or funding for substance abuse services or for law enforcement to do drug interdiction, that can become challenging. One of the most important parts of what we do is we carefully work with family advocates, which is our name for people who've experienced a tragedy related to counterfeit medicines or fentanyl, and work with them on how to effectively tell their story in a congressional office so that it actually has the right effect of moving policy and not just, creating an emotional response that doesn't necessarily move policy. That story is best told in person. And because of the physical safety issues that have been in the Capitol since January 6th, it's been actually difficult to be in person in the Capitol. In fact, it's very difficult to get meetings right now. I don't think we'll even have a fly-in this year for family advocates. So that's made it harder, because we can't use that powerful emotional story to actually work in advocacy. And the last thing, I think that this is really hard, is that I've had to accept, and I know a lot of family advocates I've worked with have had to accept this, but the tragedies that you've experienced with counterfeit drugs and fentanyl are probably one of the worst things that's ever happened to you. And it's hard to imagine that that doesn't immediately create the same urgency in legislative staff that it creates in you. And it's hard. It's really hard to sort of accept that, but that's a reality, right? Stacy and I work on these issues all the time about these illegal websites and criminals selling things, about fentanyl analogs, about to expire. And staff say that's all important, but we have to actually pass the budget for the entire federal government. It's not that you're not important, it's that this thing actually will cause even more people to have an issue. And so we do have to accept sometimes that our issue is not the priority issue, even though it feels every day like a priority to us. And that's difficult. But again, a lot of what we do is try and make sure that we communicate, realities, political realities, and we work inside them to do our best work. So let me talk a little bit about how we do advocacy. It's very different than what I think you see in other areas. First of all, we do advocacy. We don't just do education about the counterfeit drug problem. We actually do advocacy to change policies to try and make it better. And the very first thing that we make sure we do is that we avoid partisan blame. We would alienate half of the people that we need votes from if we were to start flinging around blame for one side or the other. And honestly, I've watched through many administrations on this and many other issues, and there's never an easy answer around these issues for blame. There isn't one president or administration or party or the other who gets a lot of blame. And so it's actually quite counterproductive to start doing that. And in the same way, we avoid allowing family advocates, through our advice purely, allowing them to be used in a partisan manner. And that's really important, because when you become a partisan tool, you're not appreciated. and your issues aren't getting attended to. You're just a stand-up soundbite, and then people are done with you. And that's not actually good for the issue that you want to attack. The second of which is we do very long-term relationships with elected offices. And so we actually will this year touch anywhere from 25 to at the rate Stacy's going, maybe 40 Senate offices this year. She seems determined to fill my schedule. And in doing that, we're not asking for something every time. We're trying to be a resource for education, to tell them what's going on with the crisis and make sure that what we've got is there and useful to them, so that when we do need to actually ask them to vote for something, we can do it. We also are very careful to focus on what is actually possible for the sake of credibility. There's any number of proposals out there that I think are not particularly credible. And to go to a staffer with a suggestion that's not credible is to basically ask for you not to be invited back. And we don't want that to happen. We want, we will brief advocates before they go into a meeting with some understanding of these are the topics to talk about, these are the topics to avoid. This suggestion about, let's say, let's recategorize fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, like radioactive nuclear waste. That is not going to get a staffer to start thinking about how to help you. That's going to get a staffer to look at their watch and figure out how to end the meeting and never have another one with you again. So we are very careful in making sure that you are the most credible version of yourself as you go in. And something you'll see from the work that we do in our videos is that we support agencies doing the work. Right? We want our law enforcement partners at the federal and state level to always get credit for the work that they do. And we want to make sure they have the resources to do it. And we take a lot of pains to do that. And the final thing, and this is probably no news to anybody on this call, is we refer to these deaths from counterfeit pills as poisonings and not overdoses. We believe, I think as many do, that it is not an overdose if you didn't know what was in the thing that you took. And we actually have a long-running campaign to try and get the Associated Press to change their guidance for how reporters cover this, to use the word poisonings and not overdoses. Well, that's not what this Zoom call is about. That is part of our mantra and how we want to change the language around this. And so I mentioned before about not allowing our advocates to be used for partisan purposes. That's a big one. We also work with you to learn how to tell your story in a way that is productive and fits the confines of a meeting. And it's even okay for you to read it. I had a great advocate from Tennessee who did probably 3-4 Senate meetings in one day in DC back in 2018, I think. And she read her story from a card, and that was okay. It had been constructed. She talked about her son, and she talked about what happened to him, and she did read it, but everybody understood that it was because she needed that to keep from breaking down in tears, and that's an appropriate way to handle it. That's perfectly fine. We work with victim families to talk about how not to exaggerate, and then we sometimes will do conversations with victim advocates to talk about what kind of media opportunities to take and what not to take. I actually just spoke to someone who I care very much about, who was offered a major talk show with all of the problems that come with that. The selective editing, the producers probing them to say something that they don't really want to say, and then using that and cutting out everything else. We're very protective of our family advocates, and if you ask us, we'll tell you what we think is and is not a good situation to do. Let's go ahead and bring in Lisa into this conversation. Lisa, if you could turn on your camera and your microphone, I'd like you to talk to us a little bit. Tell us Joe's story, which I think will be a familiar story to many, but is an important story to you and to me.
Well, thank you, Shabir, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. And I really do appreciate everybody's participation and interest. My son, Joe, was killed February 15, 2015. by a counterfeit oxycodone pill. The pill later on was determined to contain fentanyl. The pill was given to him by a friend, or sold to him by a friend. His friend sold him several of the pills. I actually located 4 of the pills after his death, went through his belongings. Joe was 23 years old. He liked to work out a lot. He was in physical fitness. He was in prime physical condition, and he did not use any kind of drugs or anything like that. But at that particular day, he had pulled a muscle, and he could not he did not have access to a doctor or anything like that. So he just called a friend that he trusted. Joe was going to be the father of my first grandchild, which he never lived to see. Joe died February 15, 2015. His son was born April 9, 2015, excuse me. Joe's killer, Casey Trishelle, was prosecuted as one of the first cases that we're aware of a counterfeit pill. He was charged with felony murder and a bunch of various other charges. He took a plea deal, and he is currently in prison right now for manslaughter and other charges. So at this time, he'll be eligible for parole in 2030, I believe. I do have custody of Joseph's son, who was born after his death. And so I am a mother to a kindergarten who is almost 7 years old. And my husband's trying to keep him preoccupied right now. But since then, 2015 was a tough year. Nobody at the time really had heard about fentanyl or counterfeit pills, not even the area that I'm from, and that's northeast of Atlanta, and in the Atlanta metro area. I don't even think we even knew how to spell it at the time. I think the investigators and I were Googling how to spell fentanyl. But I worked with the police investigators, and that was one of the reasons we got a plea deal. The defendant took a plea deal. We worked intensely with them, and since I have been involved with Partnership for Safe Medicines since late summer of 2015, when this lovely lady from Partnership of Safe Medicines named Deb gave me a call. And that changed a lot about my life going forward since then. And it changed a lot about what I could do to help change things. We wanted to make sure that this problem didn't escalate, but obviously it has. And I have probably met some of my best friends with Partnership of Safe Medicines, and it has really taught me a lot.
Thank you, Lisa. These pictures are from the 2018
Right.
Interchange we had in DC, where you spoke to a crowd of, I think it must have been about 50 different congressional staff and reporters, back when you could all gather in a room like that.
Yes, it was an amazing time. I was nervous, but it was an inspiring experience. I got to be around people with like-minded like myself, people who had gone through similar situations, and people, who we all had common goals. And that gave me a support group that I probably never would have been able to find before.
So on that trip and the trip in 2019, you were escorted around the Capitol by one of the many Sherpas on the PSM team and my wife being one of them, to different
Yes.
to different office meetings. Can you describe what those meetings were like as an advocate?
It was an incredible experience, for one thing, because you're up there, you're on a mission, you're with a group of people, have a common goals. These meetings have already been set up and prearranged, and they are expecting us to be there. And for me to be able to go there, it was a humbling experience as well. To be there in the nation's capital, and to be there and be able to actually speak my story and have people listen, and have have the people with Partnership for Safe Medicines there with me along the way, leading me and guiding me. It was such a support system, because I don't think any of us as family advocates could actually just done this. There's no way we could have done this on our own and be effective. Having this association with PSM has taught me how to be more effective, gave me more confidence about speaking, because speaking to Congress people and everything can be very intimidating. I mean, even, with their assistants and their staff and all, you're in an intimidated environment, and having that support system, and people who understand where you're at, where you're coming from, and believing in your story as well. And that's probably one of the biggest things that, took to my heart, but also about how I could effectively do something to see about making sure that what happened to Joe didn't happen to anybody else.
How many times, I know, Lisa, by this point, I think I probably can't even count, but you've probably done nearly a dozen Senate meetings in the time we've worked together, probably more, and also Senate committee meetings.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever met anyone for whom, any of that staff that you met with, for whom they had said that they had actually heard a story about a counterfeit pill before, or were you bringing them their first introduction to the problem?
I think there have been several times when it's been both. People that have said, "Oh, I've heard something," especially in the beginning. A lot of people were like, "Well, I heard a little bit about this, but it was still new coming out." Now, as time progressed, and I gather as we meet again and focus on these objectives, that everybody has heard about now. Pretty much everybody. When I got together with PSM, we remember that map that we have where it was color coded to where there were cases at. At the time, it was not completely colored in. Now it is.
Yeah.
So with the increase with the poisoning deaths, with the increase of the repercussions and how, this is still continuing to happen, I think as a family advocate, and that my job is not done yet. I will continue coming up there as long as I can, and as long as they will listen to me.
Well, we'll keep bringing you in as long as you got time to meet. So we actually just had a meeting together with Senator John Ossoffs' staff and one other family advocate who was her first meeting with us.
Yes.
And we got to talk about the fentanyl analogs, or variants, I think is a word that people would understand now, not the fentanyl molecule itself, but like a carfentanil or a furanol fentanyl or an acetyl fentanyl. And it's the case that that you actually got to talk to John Ossoffs' policy staff about why it was so important to make sure that these stay controlled substances. Can you talk a little about that meeting and what you felt like you actually were able to do for that staffer?
During that meeting, we discussed Joe's story, and not only just Joe's story, but other people's stories, and the impact that it was happening not just on John Ossoffs' congressional district, but because the problem is extremely profound in his district, but it's that way in all communities and so all representatives and congressional people, they need to recognize that this is not something that's not going to touch them or their community, and is going to become an issue. I think when we were talking with his staff member, I think that we gave her a lot of information that she did not know. I know that they're still pretty new and getting involved with all the different policies and proposals and all those other things coming out there. I know that it took us a minute to get a meeting established with them. And I was glad that we finally got that done. But it was a bit, I think with a lot of these staff members and a lot of our congressmen and women, this is an educational experience for them. And part of our job is to educate them for the public good and public safety.
Yeah, I think, for a staffer who's considering whether or not to advise a senator about voting on whether or not to permanently schedule these fentanyl variants, these analogs, as a controlled substance, it's one thing to hear the abstract arguments. It's another thing to have a mom say,
Yes.
my son's killer was prosecuted, and someone else's son's killer might not be as easily prosecuted if you let this scheduling lapse. And so
Correct.
I can say that, but when you say it, it has more weight. And so I think you really had an impact, both as a constituent, but as a mom who had a personal story to make them understand that this is not just some abstract policy. This actually is a policy that will have consequences if you get it wrong.
Well, I think this subject is something that really has a profound effect, and more parents and grandparents and family members are starting to pay more attention to this problem because it's becoming so widespread. And they are starting to recognize that they're not immune from that. It doesn't matter what class, what race, what neighborhood you live in. It is out there, and we are all subject to it.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, is there anything else you'd like to share with the group before we move on to the next section?
No, I just thank everybody for joining us tonight. I encourage you to follow Partnership for Safe Medicine. We're continuing to work together. I'm proud to be on the board and being a participating member, and I will continue to do so until you guys run me off. And
Never happened.
And I have met some of my best friends with this organization and a great support group. So I encourage all of you to follow Partnership for Safe Medicines and the Fake Pills Kill. Look there on our website for information and resources to talk to your kids, for teachers, for educators. There's so much information on there. And if you can't find what you're looking for, just reach out to one of us. We'll help.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shabir. Thank you.
So I'm gonna turn it over now to the woman whose brain holds much more useful information than mine, Stacy, she works for Venture Global, which is a consultant to the Partnership for Safe Medicines, and Stacy's expertise is tracking legislation and policy at the federal level, probably also at the state level, but that's not what she does for us. You can find on our website, if you go to the policy nav and click on it, our policy agenda, our legislative agenda federally for the year, and our positions, which are all approved by our advisory board, of which Lisa is one member, along with 2 other moms and a number of other experts. And everything is there with bill numbers. But I'm going to actually ask Stacy to go through some of the actually important bills and initiatives we're going to do this year, some of which which not only we, but no advocate in the area of counterfeit medicines has ever done before. And we're very, very excited. So I'm going to let you take it away, Stacy. Just say click and I'll move the slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Shabir. And Lisa, as always, it's great. I'm very sobering to hear your story as you tell it. Heart goes out to you and every family that's had to suffer a loss the way you have. So as Shabir mentioned, there's a lot of different moving pieces in Congress. And when it comes to scheduling of fentanyl analogs as controlled substances, there is no lack of legislation there. Unfortunately, a lot of the pieces of legislation come from a very partisan nature. And when you consider all of the circumstances that Shabir already outlined that create the polarization of Congress right now, there's a lot to consider when we talk about scheduling of fentanyl analogs in as controlled substances. First, there are potentially thousands of alternate fentanyl molecules, most of which have not been created or even discovered yet. I'm not a chemist, but I do know that criminals trafficking in fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances can easily manipulate the fentanyl compound in order to create a brand new unscheduled or unknown fentanyl analog in order to avoid prosecution. So a lot of what we need to do is make sure that we are educating and kind of educating our elected officials on what that means to their communities and being able to share with them these stories and to show that impact. The second, fentanyl itself is already a permanently scheduled substance. It's permanently scheduled as a Schedule II controlled substance, and that's okay. Fentanyl itself has a lot of medicinal value. It's used as pain medication for advanced cancer patients, tranquilizers for veterinarians, and as an alternate to morphine. It's very possible that at some point you yourself could be given fentanyl in a medical setting as part of like an anesthesia, you know what I'm trying to say, to help prevent pain after surgery or any other medical procedure. It usually is, prescribed as like a patch for cancer patients as well. So keeping that in mind, when we talk about having to schedule fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I, that's not necessarily what we're going for. We really just want to make sure that those controlled substances, those that are poisoning our communities, are scheduled in a way where our law enforcement officials are able to really go after and prosecute those that are trafficking in these illicit substances. And we want to make sure that our attorneys general and our prosecutors have the tools and the support behind them to be able to prosecute those who are found guilty of who are under investigation for trafficking in these substances as well. And then another a really important piece here is that right now, today, fentanyl-related substances, fentanyl analogs, technically are a Schedule I substance. There's a temporary scheduling order in place for any kind of fentanyl analogs as a Schedule I. Now that is temporary and it's currently set to expire on February 18th of this year, so in just about 2 weeks. But there is a large potential and most likely that temporary order will be extended to a later date as Congress tries to work through the criminal justice reform issues that kind of go along with all scheduled controlled substances. As both sides of the aisle kind of come together to find those grounds of compromise, Congress basically will extend the temporary order in order to provide them in order to give themselves more time to find those areas of compromise and put together a permanent solution. So as long as that temporary order continues to be extended and the status quo is maintained, that's okay. We're okay with that because it continues to give law enforcement officials the resources they need to interdict against fentanyl traffickers, and as well as continuing to support our prosecutors to going after and really getting that justice for our families. So go ahead and click. But there's a lot of other things that go through that Congress has to deal with. And one of the things, the biggest piece is the budget process. So we've we're planning on this year with the release of the next presidential budget, kind of going through and studying what kind of funding measures and recommendations are provided by the White House and the executive branch to really provide these resources for interdicting against fentanyl and fake medicines, not just fentanyl, but any kind of counterfeit medicine. Nobody's ever really done this. There's a lot of different facets that go into the budget, and the budget process itself is a very lengthy process, usually taking better part, if not longer than an entire year to get through. So just a real quick overview of kind of what goes into the budget process. First things first, the agencies, think DHS or FDA or HHS or anything, any kind of agency there, will submit their requests to the White House. That process is going on right now, getting ready for the fiscal year 2023 budgeting process. Once the White House receives those recommendations, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, will review those requests and then make recommended changes and then send it back to the agencies for the agencies to then send to the White House for consideration. A lot of back and forth. It really does. The OMB recommendations or changes to those initial budget recommendations tend to be shifted based on what the administration's priorities are. So sometimes some agencies will get more recommended dollars, others will get less. And then it's on the agencies to provide the justification to the White House when they submit their final requests as to why that dollar amount should come to them, why they should receive those amount of funding. Once that process is done, and again, that's happening right now, then the White House will release the president's budget to Congress. This year, we're expecting that to come out probably around the same time that President Biden provides his State of the Union to Congress this year, so around March 1st. And then once Congress receives those budget requests from the White House, they start their own process. And that's where it gets really sticky and fun. Basically, we'll watch, and from our perspective, PSM's perspective, we'll watch the entire appropriations process in Congress, where they'll debate and amend and kind of shape what the fiscal year budgeting process will look like. Ideally, they'll do that through once they receive the president's budget, Congress will have those hearings and those debates and be able to put forth a budget by the end of the fiscal year, which is September. Realistically, what tends to happen is a continuing resolution or some kind of omnibus bill that diverts from a government shutdown. We hear about those things all the time in the news. And, there's a lot of headlines right now talking about it, a shutdown if we don't make that the current budget extension by February 18th. But in a perfect world, the budget would then be passed by Congress around the end of the fiscal year in order to continue funding the government through the next fiscal year. So we're going to be watching that process very closely, seeing what agencies are requesting what kind of dollars, where they're going to be spending it, and how, as part of PSM's advocacy, how we can really advocate for why certain agencies need more funding in order to really counter the fentanyl crisis that we're seeing, especially given the startling and frightening numbers that were just released by the CDC and the DEA over the last couple of weeks. So it's a long, complicated process that we're going to be following very closely, but it's really part of what we're going to be doing to really showcase why we need to provide more funding to our law enforcement agencies and to the FDA and others in order to really counter this crisis we're in and limit the amount of counterfeit medicines that we're facing in our country. Go ahead and advance. So there are several ways that bills move through Congress outside of like the large vehicles, like the budget and whatnot. So we'll kind of walk through a couple of examples on issues that PSM is following closely. Unfortunately, not every bill that's introduced will actually move. And then there's others that will move quite quickly. So we have a few policy priorities from PSM's perspective that we're advocating for whenever we do meet with these offices. So the first one is an example of a bipartisan bill that has a good chance of actually moving and being adopted by Congress and hopefully then signed into the law by President. This one is the Drugs Act. So domain name lock and suspend. So what this bill does is really look to limit or eliminate the prevalence of fake online pharmacies selling counterfeit medicines online. So what we're really looking to do here is the bill looks to stop websites from selling unapproved, misbranded counterfeit drugs to the American consumers. At any given time, 95% of the roughly 35,000 online pharmacies worldwide are operating illegally in violation of state and or federal law and pharmacy practice standards. In a world of illegal online pharmacies, the lines between websites selling dangerous products and selling safe items has been very, very blurred. So this bill targets anyone who puts profits before American safety, not only non-domestic, but also domestic pharmacies that are selling unsafe medications or digital drug dealers peddling lethal fentanyl packed pills as legitimate oxycodone, for example. So this bill has bipartisan support in both chambers of Commerce, both the Senate and the House. And part of what we're doing, and we're going to be doing it all year long. And if you want to help in our efforts, please reach out to us and we will help you provide resources to help you advocate on its behalf as well, is that we're going to be talking about this bill and showcasing why this will help keep our community safe in every single office meeting that we have on Capitol Hill. And it's really important that we do that so that, you know, we share these family stories, show the impacts of not doing anything to prevent the flow of counterfeit medicines and fentanyl across our borders and into our countries. So if you want to help us with our advocacy on the Drugs Act, please reach out to us and we will help get you the resources you need. Go ahead, Shabir. Next, we have a very partisan bill that, although from PSM's perspective is a good policy, is an example of legislation that may never actually see the light of day. So with the Power Act is a piece of legislation that provides funding to state, local, and territorial law enforcement agencies in order to purchase chemical screening devices and train personnel on how to use those devices in the field. So basically what this means is that it's a bill that's looking to equip our law enforcement agencies with upgraded technology that allows them to really test for illicit substances when they're encountered with them, and being able to put in basically be able to then properly address how to approach a certain scenario that they're presented with. Again, from PSM's perspective, this is a great policy and something that we should be advocating for, but the likelihood of it passing or moving in Congress due to the partisan nature and makeup of the sponsors on the bill, it probably won't see any movement. Go ahead, Shabir. Our next example is the CAST Act, and this is basically regulating against illegal pill presses that are purchased with the intent to distribute or manufacture illicit substances. So think, somebody can order a pill press online, have it shipped to their house, and then they can start making counterfeit pills in their garage. There's no real law against having pill presses. You can make, fitness supplements or vitamins in your garage, and that's totally fine. But a lot of folks buy these under the guise of using it for supplements that way, when in actuality they're using it for making counterfeit medicines or fentanyl laced pills. So this is a great example of a bill that, while it's a priority issue for PSM, it's one that gets kind of pushed to the back burner due to the other issues of the day that are much more urgent for Congress, or at least from Congress's perspective. Like passing a budget or confirming a new Supreme Court nominee or revitalizing the economy. Like, these are what are actually moving on Capitol Hill. Whereas this bill, even the main bill sponsor hasn't responded to us in our meeting requests to talk about how we can support the movement of this bill. It's just not a priority, even though it should be from our perspective. So keeping that in mind, that it's something that we just really need to keep in mind when we do this advocacy, is showcasing why it's important, but also having the realistic expectations that it might not necessarily be a priority issue for Congress, even though it's one of the priority issues for us in our advocacy. Go ahead to the next one. And then this is a great example, the Blocking Deadly Fentanyl Imports Act. This was introduced in the last Congress, but was never really introduced in this Congress. So every 2 years, Congress resets, and every bill that did not pass in the previous Congress has to be reintroduced. This one was never really introduced. And this bill basically directs the U.S. national security agencies to provide an analysis of how foreign countries are addressing the production and distribution of fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances within their countries, and then asks those agencies to provide recommendations on what actions should be taken against those agencies, those countries that are whether they're doing enough to try and interdict against fentanyl, or if they're not, and then what kind of repercussions the U.S. can take to force them to curb the flow of fentanyl in their own countries. So this bill, again, was never reintroduced into the 117th Congress, our current Congress. However, go ahead to the next one, Spear. It appeared is part of a larger legislative goal that recently passed, the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2022. So basically, this idea of doing an analysis of foreign countries and how they're handling the fentanyl crisis made it into the Defense Authorization Bill, basically allowing the defense agencies to do this study and without really introducing the bill by itself. So what that means is that the sponsors of the bill from the last Congress then took this idea, and then during the Defense Authorization NDAA debates, inserted an amendment that included it in a larger vehicle, and then that larger vehicle was able to then be passed. And so we were able to pass that piece of legislation that way. This is something that PSM supported in the last Congress, and we were very happy to see it part of the NDAA and passed into law for this one. As this kind of builds out, it'll be really interesting to see the analysis from our national security agencies on what countries are doing enough, what countries aren't doing anything, and how the U.S. plans to respond to kind of controlling the flow of fentanyl and keeping it from coming in and hurting our families and our communities.
All right, let me just grab my camera back on here. I look better in that photo than I do in real life, but so thank you, Stacy. This is why I say that Stacy knows more than me, because I could not have given that presentation myself. And she actually knows on a daily basis what pieces of legislation are on or off the Senate calendar, which allows us to make sure that when we pull an advocate into a meeting to advocate for something, it's something that we think it's going to be a useful amount of their time. Even though a lot of these meetings now are by Zoom, we know that sometimes you have to change your schedule around and prepare, and it's a big deal to us that you give us your time, and we want to use it very wisely. So I wanted to talk really here about some opportunities that you can have to get involved and things that you can do. The first is you heard the debate about fentanyl analog scheduling. So if an analog like fentanyl, which is the substance that killed Maggie DeVita Crowley, who's a young woman profiled on our website and whose family we've worked with, if that were to become unscheduled and someone were to be prosecuted for it, one of their defenses might be that it's not a controlled substance. We don't want that to happen, right? Especially if they end up killing someone with it. But even if not, you're dealing in something that is basically fentanyl. You need to be prosecuted, and we don't want the police or the prosecutors to be held back in any way by that. And so if you look at this map that's on screen, we are collecting letters, one per state, and then a follow-up meeting, if we can make it work, from a family in that state who's been affected by a fentanyl-related death. And we've got a number of letters from around the country. And so you can see here, Oregon, California, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, and Georgia. And we have letters in process in Louisiana, Kentucky, and New Jersey. If you're from one of those states that's yellow or gray, just send us an email at editors@safemedicines.org and let us know that you'd like to write a letter. We'll actually help you with a first draft. Deb on my team will actually take a moment and help you with a first draft after hearing your story, and then we'll whip it into shape and we'll get it up to your senator's offices, and we will try and schedule a follow-up meeting with you in order to actually present that letter in person. We can't always do that, but we can try. We can try, and that's the best we could do. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I would say is a really important priority for us this year, is the Drugs Act. That is the one that would take a website that's illegally selling pills, whether they're fentanyl pills or fake Lipitor or blood thinners, one of those fake online pharmacies, and lock it up so it can't be accessed. That's called the Drugs Act. We're looking for families to help us with those stories, and it'd be really helpful to actually have letters from them as well. And so, just let us know again at the email address I put in the chat, editors@safemedicines.org, that you're interested in writing a letter. There have been websites operated by people outside of US law selling fake fentanyl pills that killed people in America. And in the case of this one in the Dominican Republic, it took 5 years to actually shut that thing down and get the guy into US court. And that's a real problem, right? That person did business for years before being shut down, and who knows how many other people that he killed that we never found out about. So, these fake websites sell both controlled substances and therapeutics. So that's a good one. In March and April, and I say this knowing that Stacy's going to do most of the work, but in March and April, we're going to do something that no advocacy group has ever done. And I've been doing this advocacy work around counterfeit drugs for over a decade. No advocacy group has ever picked apart the entire federal budget and lobbied so that every agency that is intercepting fake pills and fentanyl has a lobbying force behind it of family advocates. And we're going to do that. Stacy's going to find every part of the budget that involves giving the DEA a plane that they need, or a boat, or more agents, or giving the DOJ more prosecutors to go after fentanyl dealers, fentanyl kingpins. And we're going to lobby for them to get all the money that the White House says that they deserve. No one's ever done that. And I don't actually know if I'm biting off way more than we can chew, but I know it's the right thing to do. And I know it's something that'll actually make a difference. I can't imagine seeing how many of these agents, DEA agents, put their lives on the line to chase these folks. I can't imagine anything better I could do with my time in my life than making sure they have every last laptop, phone, boat, X-ray machine that they need to do their job. And so that's what we're going to do. That's a big one. Like, again, I may have bitten off more than I can chew, and I may have given Stacy a rock she can't lift. Although, by the way, she is like a power lifter, so she probably can lift it. But it's going to be a big project. And so I'm really excited about that. And we're going to spend most of the middle part of the year advocating for all those dollars to be gotten. And then we're going to spend the last half of the year, which I can tell you now is not going to be a great time for advocacy because we're going to be in the middle of the midterm elections. Just developing those relationships, getting that letter from you to the Senate staffers, getting that meeting if we can between you and the Senate staffers so they know who you are, so that when we need something, you've got it in. I'm really excited about all of this work, and I'm really excited about being able to give you productive things to do with your time that can really change the outcome. And I'm very, very excited. Let me just change one more slide that you saw where we are. I've seen a couple questions come into the chat. I'm going to go back and try and find a couple of them and then go ahead and throw more in the chat. I've seen people in Washington and Indiana volunteer to write letters. I don't know exactly which it was for, but I'm super excited to reach out to you. You'll hear from me, or you'll hear from Deb Carragher, who's our Family Advocate Outreach Coordinator, and that's super exciting. Let me also suggest that you go to the DEA.gov's One Pill campaign, and I'm going to ask Sven Bergman, our law enforcement consultant, to go ahead and put that URL in the everyone chat. That's super important. They've got some good resources there, and they've got a great campaign behind it. Let's see. Oh, here's a great question from Bridget Noring. Hi, Bridget. Are we able to find out specifically how many deaths were a result of Snapchat? The answer is no. One of the problems, of course, is that many of them are under investigation, and so you can't find out about these until charges are filed or the case becomes public. We just found out this week about one state that we didn't know about that had a death from a Snapchat pill that was a new state that we didn't have a recorded death for. We do track these on our website. If you go under news, you'll see social media related pill deaths, and we have a map of all the states, but we'll probably never actually know all of them. And that's really quite tragic, but we're tracking them now. I've seen a note, thank you, Ms. Jacobs, about writing a letter for Tennessee. That's great. And North Carolina and Minnesota, oh, North Carolina, my heart my heart is so happy. Ohio. There's a lot of work to do, but again, we're going to make sure that you're a part of something larger than yourself, and that you're working on things that can make a difference. And we really would be very excited to have you work with us. We are 2 minutes from 1 hour. If you have anything else that you want to ask us, I'm going to put our email address in the chat, editors@safemedicines.org. And I have one immediate request, which is we recorded this because Sven reminded me to press the record button at the beginning of the hour. And so we're going to post this recording online, probably on YouTube. And I'm going to ask you when it goes out, if you would please share it with your friends and family. We could really use your help, and this will tell them a little bit about the advocacy we're doing this year. And I could really use your help spreading the word. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to Lisa. Thank you to Stacy. Like none of this work, no one ever accomplishes anything by themselves. And so I really appreciate all the help. And thank you again to everybody volunteering in the chat. I believe I know how to save that. And so I'll be able to reach out to you after the fact to make this happen. Thank you again. Have a great night. And thank you for your faith in us.